event, which is a fourth in a series of events that we've been doing around the OBA Energy Community, highlighting different areas of the sector. I am not going to talk for long. I'm going to pass straight over to Jimmy, who is one of our alumni, and he will introduce our guest today. Over to you, Jimmy.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Hannah. And thank you very much, attendees, everyone, for coming and joining us today. My name is Jimmy Gia, like Hannah said, and I am an alum of the Oxford Business School MBA program 2008-2009, worked in energy strategies for a number of years in Seattle, Washington, and currently back at Oxford doing a PhD program in climate finance. Just a couple of housekeeping issues first. This session is being recorded for later use, and we will be sending around a link to YouTube in a couple of days. And please post your questions either in the chat box or the Q&A at the bottom of your screens. We will be using them live to have a conversation with Daniel over the course of today. Let me introduce Daniel Elizalde. Many years of experience as a practitioner in the IoT field. He was formerly the head of IoT North America at Erickson, as well as a captain of the sustainability team. And it'd be great to get a little bit of conversation around IoT and sustainability at the same time, which is the purpose of today. And prior to that, one of his other experiences, which is very relevant to the energy conversation, is also the head of products at STEM Incorporated, which is an AI energy storage company. And so we can have both the conversation of how IoT companies look at sustainability, as well as how energy companies look at IoT. Currently, he's also a product manager instructor at Stanford University, and we're very fortunate to have him today with us for our hour. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. Thank you so much, Hannah, for having me. Very excited to be here.
So to kick it off, I wanted to ask, you have your experience in both the energy sector as well as the IoT sector. And in one of your blogs, you mentioned that IoT and sustainability are very similar in terms of their approaches. So why do you think IoT is a good analogy for sustainability?
Yes, I think there's multiple parts to that. The way I see it is that from a sustainability perspective, one of the biggest challenges that the world has in terms of achieving sustainable goals have to be with emissions. And a lot of what generates emissions is burning fossil fuels. And so when you're trying to address a problem like that, any type of problem like that, the first thing that you need to do is start by measuring and being able to connect the physical world with the digital world, so you can start installing sensors and you can start figuring out, what are your baselines, and as you start introducing products and processes and initiatives to have an impact in sustainability, you need to be able to measure those. And so IoT at its core, it's just a network of sensors and computing power that analyzes data from the physical world and allows you to make decisions out of that. And so energy companies, let's say utilities, are really looking into IoT as ways to better understand the physical world and how they can manage it better. And then from the other side, technology companies are making sure that their products are also more sustainable in how much energy the products themselves use. And that also has to do with measuring and a lot of the processes that we're going to talk about through this event. So it's a mixture of the two, and it's just the enabling of measuring the physical world and to be able to make decisions.
And so in some ways, the IoT becomes the enabler of the sustainability future, and the two are intimately related and tied together.
Correct. And it's just a tool, to be honest. IoT is just the tool that you need in order to be able to get the measurements that you need in order to create the programs that are going to create the baseline, and then you can improve upon. Because without that, or without automated measurements or consistent measurements, it's impossible to make that progress. So that's why that piece is so important.
Great. Why don't you walk us through how you think of IoT development and how you think of sustainability development and where that overlap comes when you're working on, as head of products?
Yes, I think that a product strategy needs to be all-encompassing, and we'll go into frameworks in a second, but you need to look at the needs of the customers, you need to look at the business models, and then now it's more important than ever to look at the sustainability impact that your product will have, and both as a differentiator and just as a social responsibility to make sure that you're not increasing the problem. And so it turns out that as you're building these types of products, especially IoT that has hardware and has embedded software and has cloud software and has AI and all these components, every piece has either something that can help you differentiate in terms of sustainability, or an area that you can optimize so that the impact on sustainability can be less, whether it is the waste that it produces, the type of circular economy that it enables, the energy consumption, etc. So it has to be one of those pillars that you think about in your product strategy, just like business models, just like security models, just like data strategy. Sustainability has to be part of that overall strategy. It doesn't happen by accident.
Great. Why don't you, I know you prepared a couple of slides to talk us through more in detail of this framework. Why don't we switch over to that?
Yeah, of course. I'm going to share my screen. And let me know if you're able to see my slides.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So the focus that I want to have here is on sustainability as a tool to help your customers and to help you as an executive or a technology practitioner to add additional value to your company and to your customers. A lot of companies look at sustainability as a burden, as a tax, as something that's going to slow you down, something that is going to affect you. But in reality, there are two ways that you can use it to help your customers. And as this slide says, one of the ways is you can help companies achieve their sustainability goals. And this is becoming more and more apparent. More and more companies are coming out saying that they have sustainability targets, that they are going to be carbon neutral in 2040 or 2050. And so these companies want to get to those targets. So now their procurement departments are going to be looking at their suppliers in a different way. And they actually have this analysis on the value to the business has to be there, of course, for your product. But also, is this going to help us or affect us in helping us get to our sustainability goals? And so if your product, and I'm going to give an example in the next slide, but if your product actually helps these companies meet their sustainability goals, let's say that the sustainability goals have to do with carbon neutrality, and that has a big portion is reducing energy consumption, then if your product helps with that, in addition to the other values that it proposes, you're going to have a differentiated value in the market. The reverse is also true. Some of these companies are not going to look at suppliers that don't meet specific criteria, and they are not going to buy your products if indeed they affect their sustainability goals. And the key here is that because the sustainability goals oftentimes are anchored at the C-level or at the board of executives, sometimes companies are willing to pay more for products that help them achieve this goal. So it's no longer a race to the bottom in terms of price. Right? If the value in multiple areas, including sustainability, is there, you have an advantage. Now, the other part where you can help your customers is to reduce the cost of operation. And the example here specifically is the cost of electricity. In heavy industry, say manufacturing, telecommunications, the cost of energy is one of the biggest line items in their P&L. And if your product, in addition to helping them, achieve the value that your product's supposed to do, also helps them reduce their cost of operations, basically uses less energy in this particular example, or consumes less fuel, then the margins of the company are going to grow, and that reduction of cost of operations is going to be seen as a big differentiator. So these are two areas where you can focus on as you're thinking about how to incorporate sustainability. Notice that I am not going on the path of saying the social responsibility part of sustainability, because that is a byproduct. And unfortunately, even today, companies don't value that enough to actually do business by that pillar. And so you have to make sure that you are figuring out a business objective. And so costs, time, specific corporate goals like sustainability goals. Otherwise, I've seen a lot of companies have products that they're only focused on the social responsibility part and they don't get any traction. So you have a question? Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like earlier when we were talking how you say clean tech companies are focused on clean tech, but they lose sight of the business model. And in many cases, the product companies, they focus on the product and they lose sight on sustainability, right? And you're saying you got to be able to merge those two together.
Exactly. And let me go to the example, and I'll tell you more about the strategy and the role that leadership really plays in those scenarios. So to put it in a more concrete way, I'm going to share this example from my time at Erickson. Erickson is known as one of the most sustainable managed companies in the world. In fact, they just won an award like 2 weeks ago. And so sustainability is a very important part, and that has to be reflected in how the company does business, but also their products. And so this slide here, I think is really interesting because this shows you the energy consumption of Ericsson's core products throughout the generations. So if you're not familiar, Ericsson is one of the leaders in providing cellular network connectivity around the world. So they produce anything to run a cellular network: radios, the base stations, the data centers, everything. And so if we go back to the previous generations of cellular connectivity, 2G, 3G, they all use a certain amount of energy to operate those cell towers and those data centers. And when you are working in this type of industry, the energy consumption is so big that some of the biggest customers from Ericsson, let's say AT&T and Verizon, for 4G, their energy consumption bill is in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars every year. And that's a fixed cost. And so the challenge really was, if the technology keeps advancing and we keep deploying more of these towers and the coverage keeps growing and the technology is more power hungry, it gets up to a point that it puts you outside of market. It prices you out of market because operating this technology is far more expensive than what customers are willing to pay. People are not going to pay that much for 5G if it's going to be twice as much, right? And so the challenge was, how do we, in a dual way, help our customers meet their sustainability goals, because they have targets for carbon neutrality, but also how do we make sure that our products are less energy hungry? And so you can see that for 5G, Ericsson has this concept called breaking the energy curve, where 5G networks use the same amount of energy than 4G networks, but with an exponential degree of increased performance. And so that's a big deal, right? Because now, by listening to the challenges of your customers, Ericsson made strategic decisions in their portfolio to say, we're going to invest in making our systems less energy hungry, because it's going to reduce the cost of operation and it's going to help us meet our customer sustainability goals, and it's going to differentiate us in the market. So I think this is a good example of how those two things fit together. And I can go to the next slide and show you a little bit more about how that thinking goes. But I'll stop if you have a question about this, Jimmy.
Well, I wanted to also ask, you were both the head of IoT North America as well as a captain on the sustainability team. How did those two groups interact with each other?
Yeah, it's interesting because my role as a captain of the sustainability team was more about spreading the word internally and externally on how Erickson does all this practice that makes our technology more sustainable. Now, as head of IoT, I was focused on emerging business. What new types of businesses and revenue lines can we open up for our customers by leverage IoT? Now, when I say by leveraging IoT, it really means IoT on top of cellular networks that happen to have this sustainability benefit already. Right? So there were kind of two different areas of the business. I was in emerging business for IoT, and this is more on the core business. But the philosophy of sustainability transpires throughout the company. So even when I was working in innovation, future products for the company, sustainability was always present. What is going to be the impact? What is going to happen with when we recycle this? What's going to be the energy consumption, et cetera? So it's a mindset that has to permeate everywhere.
You know, and since you were head of IoT and you were in product development, what were some of the customer needs that you've heard about from the sustainability angle that you were then trying to solve and you were trying to address?
Yeah, the main challenges that we heard was, it's interesting because from a customer perspective, oftentimes it never comes up as a sustainability issue. It's more of a price point issue, right? How can you help us make purchasing your systems and operating your systems through their lifetime less expensive? And so by doing the analysis on figuring out where are all the areas where we can actually reduce cost and increase performance, and with the philosophy of the company that you have to be very sustainability oriented, that's when you start merging those two, right? And then I can show you in the next slide, when you think about product development, well, there are a lot of different areas, a lot of different things that you can do of how you get there, right? But it's just, it all starts with, the pain of the customer. Oftentimes, the people interested in the sustainability are different than the people that are going to be in procurement buying the product. But you have to listen to them both, and then figure out where you can actually make your adjustments.
That's great.
Many companies decide to make the adjustment just in price or on the parts or somewhere else, right? But I think if there's one message from this conversation is that, hey, you can actually impact the cost of operation of your product by focusing on its energy consumption, and that's achieves the same result.
Great. Why don't we continue on?
Yeah, so let me walk you through a framework that I developed, and this is what I've been teaching at Stanford and I do with my clients outside of Erickson, of how I think about putting together all these decisions for IoT. And this works also for non-IoT products, and let me tell you why. So the idea first is that in order to be able to convey these decisions to leadership, we have to have a basic grounding on what is it we're talking about. So that's why I like to always start with the technology stack by saying, this is our product. This is what our product looks like in terms of components. And so in terms of IoT, all products will have device hardware. That's where you have your sensors, your edge compute, your processing at the edge. You have device software. You have a communications channel, also called connectivity. And that's where you could have Wi-Fi or cellular or something else. And then in these modern technologies, you usually have a backbone made of the cloud. And then you have applications that are connected to the cloud. So this is a very basic stack for IoT. And so if your product is not IoT, you only do hardware, well, you can only focus on the left two parts. But if you're only like a SaaS type of offering, then you can just focus on the parts on the far right, right? So the same model applies. Now, the next part of the framework is what they call these decision areas. And these decision areas are basically the management decisions that as technology professionals, we have to make in order to move our product forward, our product strategy forward. And these areas are UX, data, business, technology, security, and standards and regulations. And so the way to use this framework is to walk each decision area across the stack and see how it relates to the stack. So let me give you that in more detail. The UX decision area focuses on asking the question, who are my users? Both internal customers or external customers, and what are their needs? This is understanding their pains. And in this type of complex industrial products, energy products, it's important to understand the users across the stack. So who are your users at the device hardware level, at the device software level, at the networking level, cloud platform level, and applications? Because those might be different, right? For example, the people that do the installation and maintenance of energy systems are going to be different than the people that interact with your analytics dashboards in the cloud. They all have needs, and you have to figure them out. You have to have a strategy for all of them, right? So this framework helps you have that conversation and identify all those users. The next thing is, once you understand the user's needs, you need to understand how the data flows throughout that stack. So what data do you need to acquire in your sensors in your device hardware? Let's say you are having a energy efficiency type of a solution. Well, you're going to need to measure energy consumption, maybe I don't know, many other things, right, in the device hardware. What data is acquired there? What data is processed at the device software level? What data is transferred to the communications link to the cloud, and so on. Once you understand the basic data strategy, then comes the business strategy. And so in this decision area, you talk about how will you monetize your solution? What are your overall costs? And how do you define partners and build versus buy strategy? And you do the same at the same level, right? So will I monetize my device hardware, or will I monetize installing applications at the edge? Will I charge my customer for the networking communication, or that comes in the package? What kind of applications can I monetize? How much does it cost me to run this full stack, etc.? And then it comes to the technology decision area. So once you understand the customer needs, the data needs to produce, how you're gonna monetize it, well, what technology do you use to build that solution? What technology do you use for your device hardware, device software, etc.? And then in this framework, it also includes security. So how will you make sure that each layer is secure, and the device hardware, device software, communications, etc.? And what standards and regulations apply at each layer? Now, the interesting thing is that all these decisions relate to each other. And so that's why you have to iterate. The decisions that you make at the UX layer, so who is your user, what are their needs, are going to affect your data strategy. Your business decisions on how you monetize things are going to affect what technology you pick. The technology you pick is going to affect how you implement security, but it might affect the user experience and so on. Right? And so with this in mind, the whole purpose of a framework like this is to have these active conversations about product strategy and think about the repercussions of everything against everything. And this is where the sustainability conversation can happen. Meaning, from a UX perspective, if we want to provide a sustainability visualization or a sustainability look and feel to our product, where does that go and how does it look? If our goal, in addition to the value that we deliver to our customer, if we also need to track the energy consumption of our device so that we can manage it accordingly so that it's not a power hog. Okay, what data do we need? How are we going to process? How are we going to send it out? And then what impact does that have in the costs? And can we actually monetize that additional value of being sustainability focused? Does that being sustainability focused affects the technology decisions, the security, et cetera, right? And so my point is, going back to the slide about the energy curve from the Erickson example, is that those decisions in order to make your product more sustainable and consume less energy don't happen by chance, right? It needs to be part of your strategy. And this is what a strategy looks like. These are all the different pieces that you need to understand in a strategy. and need to figure out that all the pieces fit together so that you have something your customers want, still can make money, and you're having that impact in sustainability. And I'll stop there, Jimmy, to let you take over.
No, thank you. I think this is a really fantastic model, and I've certainly read about a number of your writings on it. Would you say, from your experience and just exposure to the IoT space, do you have examples of what you think are good, exemplary examples of where sustainability and IoT were well merged together into the product?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have a lot of examples on companies that wanted to, that the whole purpose of the product was to impact sustainability, like STEM, right? Yes, it provides value to reduce energy, but the whole idea is to create virtual power plants that can reduce the need of peaker plants, right? So that is a really good example. And the technology that we use at STEM is exactly this, right? It has hardware, including the battery and the controller. It has the AI at the edge. It has cellular communication, et cetera, right? So that's one example.
Could you
Now,
just elaborate a
go ahead.
little bit about what STEM was and the product of STEM? I know it was in demand response and peak shaving, but what give a quick little background on that.
Of course. So STEM is a GE-backed startup that leverages artificial intelligence to control assets to reduce the energy consumption in commercial buildings. And most of the assets that they control is batteries, so big industrial batteries. And the whole idea is the client, let's say a skyscraper, buys one of these systems, installs one of these big batteries in their basement, and then through artificial intelligence and through connectivity to the cloud, the battery learns the patterns of the building, and then it starts charging when the price of energy in the grid is cheap, and then when the price of the energy is more expensive, the battery discharges. And so it saves you money by basically using the energy that is cheapest, but also operated as a dual market in the sense that from a utility perspective, STEM is able to sell a group of these buildings, and through the software in the cloud, those buildings look like one unit of load to the utility. And then when the utility, it's a very hot summer day, everybody's turning on their air conditioning and plugging in their electric vehicles at home, instead of the utility having to turn on another peaker plant, which pollutes more and it's a lot more expensive, they can just fire the STEM system and through the internet ask all these batteries to discharge so that all these buildings don't have to grab energy from the grid, right? So it's a combination of demand response, virtual power plant, and then energy efficiency, all through artificial intelligence and IoT.
Great, and all enabled by the cloud and things like that.
Exactly. All those components, and that's what's the interesting part of these systems that are very complex, because each of these blocks has a lot of technology and a lot of business and data and security decisions behind them. So putting together these IoT industrial energy systems, it's complex. It's complex, and that's why this type of conversations and this type of frameworks help a lot, just so that we can communicate with the rest of our company what is it that we're building and what are the challenges, where are the pitfalls.
Yeah. For those listening on, please feel free to put your questions into the chat box. I'll continue the conversation, but would love to invite people to put their inquiries and curiosities in as well. Generally speaking, one of the things that I find is people who are not software experts find it really difficult to be able to manage software teams or relate to software teams. And then personally, what I've also found is that it's the exact same problem with energy engineers. Energy engineers is really difficult for the layperson to relate to, understand the teams, and to be able to set those priorities and those metrics. You had to work between both the software experts as well as the energy experts when you're working at STEM. How did you bridge those gaps of two different, deep expertise, but quite different in terms of how they work with each other?
Yes, that was an interesting challenge. And that's one of the key aspects of the product management profession, which is my focus. And I've always focused on industrial type of product management solutions. And so I have, when I started working at STEM, I had the expertise or the experience working with software and working with this stack on how all the pieces fit together. And I remember my conversation when I was in the interviews with STEM. I've always been passionate about energy, and I, kind of learned myself enough to be conversant. But during the interview, they asked me, so why should we hire you versus some people that have a lot more industry expertise? And my answer was, well, I know I have the knowledge that you're missing, which is how to work with this technology to put it together to form a solution and work with data science teams, hardware teams, software teams to understand the customer pains, right? More energy people, you have a lot of those already. And so if I can get partnered with a subject matter expert to translate some of those customer needs on what does that mean for the product that needs to be built, then you'll get the best of both worlds. And so that's a common thing that happens in product management. We can't be experts in all of it. I specialize in being an expert in this complex stack solutions. And that's why today I coach people from energy and healthcare and pure SaaS and e-commerce, because it's more about how do you put the solution together and then you pair it with the experts in order to get to the bottom of what the pain of the customer is. But the same tools and techniques apply.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at this framework that you've created, I'm sure this came out of many years of experience working in the field. Are there general areas of this model that you found people overlooking? Hence, coming up with it became a really good way to say, no, these are actually all of the different issues we have to talk about. So what's commonly missing and what's commonly lacking?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've found that the five pieces of the technology stack, device hardware, device software, et cetera, it's a good representation. When I work with specifically either with previous companies or clients, there's always more building blocks that you have to add to make it more realistic to what the real solution is. But this is a great starting point. So I think just getting agreement that these pieces exist opens the conversation. Then the first challenge that I see is that people always want to start in the technology decision area, which is how do we build this? When in reality, you first need to understand your customer's problem, because if you don't understand that problem, how can you build towards that? And so I always get a lot of pushback with, no, we have to start with technology. No, we can build it. Most likely we can build it. But what are we building for? And then the data, and then the business models. And then I think the last thing that is surprising for a lot of people is the security and the regulations to be part of this strategic model, because usually those are an afterthought for people. But once you see how security impacts your overarching strategy or regulations impact your whole strategy, you have to take it together. So those are some of the things that I've seen the most. But always is, let's start with technology. And it's like, nope.
I think it's the same in business as well. In business schools, we frequently teach you have to look at your customer need first. What problem are you solving? It's not the tech. You don't want the problem looking for a solution. You don't want the solution looking for a problem. You want to already have defined the problem before applying the right solution.
Right. And I think that us working in technology industries, we are a little bit or a lot to blame for that, because we are the masters of hype. And companies get bombarded with all these technology trends or technology products that are going to be the silver bullet for all your problems, right? Whether it is IoT or blockchain or 5G or edge compute, I can name 1,000. And so people just hear that and gets ingrained in that, and the vendor is right there to satisfy that need. And so that's why a lot of people, I talk to a lot of people that say, can you help me figure out how to integrate 5G into my strategy. And it's like, why, right? Or our strategy needs to include AI. What are your goals? Well, we'll figure it out, but AI will tell us, right? And so I think that there's a big push. We have to stop that first. But as executives in companies, we have to take a step back and say, what is the customer problem first? And then what technologies can help us? And then, hype aside, we can make strategic decisions. But I think we need to take a step back and look at the reality before we commit to the hype.
Great. Simon Gage has a question to talk about some of the hardware. I think most of our conversation so far has really been focused on the software, whether it's how do we apply these into the cloud and look at pulling together these virtual power plants and such. But if we look at the hardware itself has a carbon footprint, and the hardware itself has an energy footprint. So how do you think about embedded energy inside of the product itself, especially since companies like Erickson's, their goal is to just sell more product?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a big challenge, right? I do like this idea of the circular economy, that as you're thinking about your product, you need to understand what is going to be the impact of that product to the world, right? To sustainability in all aspects. So that has to do with energy consumption. That has to do with what type of materials are you going to use? Are those materials, the sourcing of those materials, going to be causing other issues? Is the transportation of your product from the manufacturer to a destination having a big carbon footprint? All those things. And the exercise that I always do with folks that I work with is, you have to come up with a list of all those things, and then figure out which ones you want to tackle first, and then move to the next one and the next one. And it has to do with where you are in the adoption life cycle of your product. If you are a very early startup, your goal right now is to demonstrate market fit, and it's really not the best time to start optimizing for sustainability and cost, right? Because you really don't know where you're going to end. But when you're starting to get to a market fit and you're starting to see the potential to go into scale, that's when optimizing for scale comes into play. And it's not only about cost, it has to be about sustainability as well. And so at that point is, can we use components that are less power hungry? Can I invest now, 2 months of embedded software developers to actually minimize the performance or the energy usage of my microcontrollers, right? And that is the time, right? So you have to think about it, but there has to be the right time. So I think the fact that, you're thinking about it, it's great. It's really good. Just make sure that that doesn't stop you from achieving your ultimate goal. And it has to be done as part of the development process, not just in bulk all at once. Does that answer your question?
While we wait for Sam, let me just ask a quick follow-on question. Have you, as head of products, ever seen people include inside of the bill of materials decision how recyclable that end product becomes? Like when you turn in a cell phone, recycle a cell phone, whatever, are those recycling decisions taken into account when you're developing that future product?
Yes, I've seen that. As some of the more forward-looking companies, Erickson is one of them, right? The bill of materials includes that, because you're thinking ahead. You actually have at STEM as well, we had a recycling of batteries program. So end of life of the battery, you just throw it away. We take it in and we repurpose it for other types of applications that were not as demanding, where an old battery can still be useful, right? So yes, I've seen that. It's not as common as I would like, but companies are starting to do it. I also see it that the more advanced companies not only do it in the bill of materials, but also do it in their supply chain. So for you to be a supplier of this bill of materials, you have to have a certain sustainability score, right? It's like you you power your manufacturing facilities with solar, or et cetera. There's criteria there, right? But so the more advanced companies are trying to think about not only the product itself, but the manufacturing and transportation and deployment of their product to have the least carbon footprint as possible. But again, it's very early, and it's unfortunately, I have an article about this topic where the biggest job of the product leader that is focused on sustainability is to convince the executives that you actually have to invest time and money to do that. And we're still at that stage that it's understood, but it's still hard to do, just to be very honest, right? Unfortunately. So that's why I'm so glad to have this discussion with Oxford leaders, because you're going to be the ones leading those conversations at your companies.
Great. And just one final follow-up from Simon before we move on to the next question. Looking at a product life cycle as well, it's one thing to be able to embed these decisions into making the product, but you also want, ideally, you also want that product to be durable. And so, Simon, it sounds like what you're trying to ask is, how do you make those products durable so that they last for a much longer period of time to increase that return on investment for the client?
Yes, that's a really good question, and I can put it in two parts. One is usually at the very beginning of a product, especially when it has hardware, you have to understand the purchasing and the life cycle expectations of your customer. For example, for working with utilities, everything has to at least last 10 years in the field. I've worked with other products that are hardware devices, battery powered, that at least have to last 3 years. And so you have to do the engineering and everything so that you meet that, right? So one is just setting that goal from the beginning and working with your engineering team to figure out what materials, what technology. That's one part. The other part is understanding that technology nowadays, it's all iterative. And so making sure that you build your product so that you can easily upgrade it so that it becomes more efficient as opposed to less efficient with time. A perfect example of this is the Tesla cars. The Tesla cars, they're pretty much software powered. And so with every new upgrade of the software, the cars become more reliable. The battery usage is better. The safety is better. And so thinking early on, what are the things that you might not fine tune at launch, but you have the capability with software upgrades to make your product more sustainable, right? So maybe you have hardware that is as sustainable as possible, but it's not optimized because the software that drives it, you don't have the time right now, or you don't know if it's worth it right now. But as you move on, you make sure that you continue to upgrade via software. I've also seen companies that build their hardware in a modular way so that it's very easy on a service call to replace some components, right? The technician is going to be there anyway. They can just replace one component for another, and all of a sudden it's the next generation of sustainability, reliability, etc. So all those are decisions that even this framework can help you make, right? Because you can ask those questions and then figure out, okay, what is the impact of having modular components in my hardware that can be replaced by a technician on a service call? What's the experience for that technician? What data do we need to collect for that? What is the impact on our cost model, et cetera, et cetera? So again, long answer, but very, very good question.
Great, and it shows the robustness, I think, of how many questions are subsequent to just these 6 that you list right now. Raman has the question, looking at IoT applications in global logistics. So what do you think are the prospects for IoT to improve the environmental impacts, as well as better access social empowerment of smaller businesses?
That's a really great question. And I think logistics, it's one of the areas where IoT is taking hold, right? Because part of the challenge with logistics, it's that connection of the physical world that needs tracking, that needs monitoring. And so if you're able to add intelligence to your logistics assets, right? Whether they're boxes or whether they're your trucks or whether they're trains or ships. Now, through software and through artificial intelligence and machine learning, you can optimize a lot of things that in the past was really hard to optimize for a human. So you can optimize routes of delivery, or you can optimize the capacity, you can optimize what boxes go on which truck based on where they're going to go a lot faster. And so we're seeing a big advantage of leveraging IoT for those kind of worldwide logistics. And cellular is being a game changer for that, because with cellular connectivity, you have wireless connectivity pretty much around the world. And so for worldwide logistics, if you're able to keep track of something and continuously optimize it in real time, because it's always connected around the world, it opens the door to a lot of potential, right? So we're seeing a lot there.
Great. And Raman, certainly let us know if we answered your question through either the chat box or the Q&A. A couple of other questions. In reading some of your writings that you've talked about, sometimes you've mentioned that IoT and sustainability miss the mark when they're trying to enter the market with their product. Why do you think that it's so hard to make money on IoT? And then similarly, I think from sustainability, we see that it's really hard to make money on sustainability products.
Yes. There's a lot of reasons why it's really hard to make money with IoT. And I think one of the reasons is apparent in this diagram. There's a lot of components, there's a lot of different pieces, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong. One of the main challenges is that, as you can see, you have these 5 technology stack components, right? Hardware, device, software, communication, etc. So no single company can actually build the technology for everything. And so you have to use vendors and you have to use partners. Usually software companies partner with hardware companies and vice versa. And so when you start building solutions to address complex problems that require many technology companies to come together to put the solution, that in addition require system integration to do the last mile of deployment, then having a business model that works with all that, it's has been proving very challenging. I can tell you from experience, I just said how cellular connectivity is going to be a game changer for logistics. It's being, well, if you take the other side, cellular connectivity is still too expensive for logistics applications for the demand that we need. And so the business model of the different providers is not aligned, and it's really, really, really hard. So yeah, that we're seeing that across the industry in all verticals: energy, healthcare, logistics, manufacturing, telecommunications, transportation. It's hard, and it's not a technology problem, it's a business model problem.
And actually, that's interesting. The next question was on IoT business models. And you mentioned there's a lot of very well-known business models: subscription, outcome-based, asset sharing, monetizing the data, pay-per-use, etc. When I start thinking of energy and sustainability companies, it seems like that's the exact same list of business models that these sustainability companies are chasing after. And so it seems like the overlay and the similarities between IoT and sustainability is far more grounded in just how they're being approached by these 2 completely different sectors. And perhaps there's a lot of lessons learned that the 2 sectors can share.
For sure, I completely agree, because I think that the IoT is not necessarily an industry, it's just a trend, right? Because each of the areas of the technology stack is a industry. Cloud is an industry, hardware and sensors is an industry, telecom is an industry. And so putting them all together is kind of like a well known thing now, or better known now. And that applies for healthcare, that applies for logistics, and the same applies for energy, right? And so I think that goes back to some of the initial questions that we had, where I see a lot of the big misses in energy is that I talk to a lot of executives from energy companies, and they're stuck with the how do we build it, how do we put it together, how do we operate it, as opposed to what is the real pain that you're trying to solve for your customer. And so I see that needs to converge a lot better. And once you get that problem first, then putting together solutions like this, whether it's for energy or any other industry, is much more doable.
Great. Looking at some career questions, where do you think are the biggest needs for future expertise?
Wow, that's a great question. One of them, and I must be biased, but I think product management, because as you can see, product management is about that intersection of understanding the customers, understanding how the technology works, and figuring out how you create a viable business model. So that intersection is important, especially as I talk to energy companies. They are usually full of either engineers or energy experts, but they're missing that part that puts all the pieces together. So I think product management and all the way to product leadership is key, I think. I think another part that is important is more of a skill. It's system thinking. Because as you can see, this is a system made of multiple very different parts. And so being able to take a step back and see it as a system and seeing all the different components and how they operate together, that's a skill that is very, very important for this kind of super complex solution, right? And then the last one that I want to point out, I believe it's some flavor of data science, whether it is machine learning, understanding machine learning or artificial intelligence, not necessarily becoming a data scientist unless that's what you want, but from a business perspective, how do you work with data scientists and how do you extract the value? Because at the end of the day, these types of solutions, they're really data-driven solutions. They acquire data, they process data, and they deliver data so that you can make decisions. And so the engine that drives those decisions is data science. So understanding how to work with data scientists, what is the life cycle, how do you interact with them, I think it's a super important skill. And in fact, if you allow me, I have a slide with my podcast. And actually today I released an interview with the Chief Innovation Officer from Hitachi, and he is a data scientist. And so if you want to deep dive, we had a great conversation there.
Great. Let me summarize the key points of our conversation, then love to give you the last word where we can talk about some of your podcasts and other activities. But as I was taking notes over the course of today, I think my takeaway is what you said near the end, that IoT is really just a trend. And IoT is a trend of integration of how all these different components are coming together. And when I think of the Paris Agreement, a 1.5 degree goal or a 2 degree goal, these notions that we have from the clean climate side, sustainability side, those are really just integration trends across many different fields and sectors that somehow have to be coordinated and work together. And so being able to ask these similar questions would also help some of those people inside the climate fields. When we think about it from that point of view, sustainability really needs to be embedded into the product. We can't just think of the sustainable outcome of a product, but it has to be thought through the entire design from the beginning. And perhaps one of the stakeholders that we have overlooked in the business side is the power of the purchasing agent in being part of that sustainability equation, because certainly those purchasing departments are trained to look at the financial returns and the product technical specifications, but they also need to be trained to start looking at some of the sustainability aspects, the long-term operational costs, and being able to put those into the decision matrix as well. And as we were saying at the very end, technology is relatively easy once you know your customer problem. But if you start with a technology, then you're going to be flailing around and rehashing that technology over and over again as you try to find that customer problem that you're trying to meet. Any last words from there? I'd love to learn a little bit more about your podcast.
Of course, I appreciate that. I think you summarized it really well. I think the one thing that I would add to your last comment about how once you get the technology, once you get the customer problem, the technology is easy. I agree 100%. And I would even add, IoT type of solutions are very, very expensive to build. It's not like building, a simple app or, some consumer type product, because it has all these components and it has a hardware and communications and everything we talked, they're very expensive. And so the more you can do upfront to understand your customers, to do prototypes, to do validation, the better you will be. Because otherwise, if you launch into building, like in other more simpler solutions, say, well, you build it, it didn't work, 2 months, go out the door. No, I've seen companies run out of funds, well-funded startups trying to go and build these kind of things, and they run out of funds fairly quickly. It's very expensive. So something to keep in mind.
Great. Do you want to go through your last couple of slides in the few minutes we have?
Yeah,
left?
of course. Yeah, I mean, it's just one slide. Just first of all, thank you so much, Jimmy and Hannah, for having me. It was a excellent conversation. I hope it was insightful and useful for everybody. And I have a lot of this information that Jimmy was referring to at my site, so danielelizalde.com, including my podcast, where I have a lot of discussions with executives of all sorts of companies, a lot of them energy companies, about how do you work with enterprise solutions? How do you work with IoT? What are the challenges? So something to follow up if you're interested as well.
Yeah,
and with that, just happy to have more questions and connect. And again, thank you so much, Jimmy, for the opportunity.
Of course, Daniel, thank you again for coming and joining us. And thank you to Hannah and Said Business School for putting the program together today. This video will be posted on YouTube once we're done with this. So that should be available into the OBA email lists once that's there. And just a plug for the next program, hot off the press, just from a couple of hours ago. On December 14th, Richard Barker is going to be hosting a program on how companies should report on sustainability. And I'm sure that's going to be quite a very interesting program as well. So thank you all to those who attended, and look forward to seeing you next time.